Would you marry me? The words tumbled from Eliza Hartley's lips with a strange, delicate force, like petals drifting from a high branch too light to land hard, but impossible to ignore. Across the yard, Marcus Delane froze mid-swing, hammer poised above a warped fence post. The late summer air, thick with honeysuckle and humming cicadas, swallowed the silence that followed. Eliza stood barefoot on the porch steps, a glass of lemonade in one hand, the other curled around the knot of a dish towel slung over her shoulder. She wore a soft gray sundress, the hem kissed with grass stains, her sunlit curls tied up in a way that suggested she didn't care much what the world thought, except she did, just not enough to let it stop her. "You serious?" Marcus finally asked, not turning yet. Eliza raised an eyebrow. "Serious-ish. Depends on your definition." He let out a slow exhale, not quite a laugh. "You always ask strangers to marry you after 3 days of fence repairs?" "Only when they swing a hammer like they've got more on their mind than wood." That made him look up. His eyes dark, steady, tired met hers with quiet curiosity. "And if I said yes? Then I'd ask what kind of cake you want at the wedding, chocolate or lemon." He chuckled, finally turning to face her fully. His shirt was damp with sweat, clinging to the lean muscle across his back, and the brim of his cap cast a sliver of shadow over his brow. "You always this forward?" Eliza shrugged. "Only when I've spent 3 days pretending I wasn't watching you fix a fence like it was holding your life together." Marcus rested the hammer on the rail and stepped back, surveying the work so far. "Not bad for a fence. Not bad for a man who doesn't say much. I talk when it matters." "Then tell me something true." He studied her face for a long beat. "I didn't come here to fall in love." "I didn't ask you to," she said. "I asked if you'd marry me." They both laughed then, the kind of laughter that comes not from amusement but from the shock of connection. She turned back toward the house, pausing halfway up the steps. "Lemonade's not going to drink itself." Marcus followed. The kitchen was cool, the air heavy with the scent of mint and pine cleaner. Her 6-year-old son, Theo, was asleep on the couch, clutching a faded Spider-Man plush. A drawing of a smiling sun with stick legs hung crooked on the fridge. The house bore the gentle chaos of survival. Clean dishes drying on the counter, books stacked in corners, a half-finished laundry basket in the hall. "You want sugar in your tea?" Eliza asked, pouring into mismatched glasses. "Not the kind that comes with expectations." She smiled. "That's not sugar, that's guilt." He grinned, but didn't reply. Instead, he sipped, watching her over the rim of the glass. She was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind life weaves into your bones. But there was something else, too. A steadiness, a resistance, like she'd built her own spine out of second chances. "How long you been here?" he asked. 5 years. Bought it with the last of the insurance money and a silent prayer. It was falling apart. Still is. But it's mine." "And the fence?" "Richard, my ex, he hated it. Said it made the house look small. I kept it anyway. Some things are worth the space they take up." Marcus nodded, then set his glass down. "Mind if I finish up before it gets too dark?" She stepped aside. "You know where the boards are?" Out front, the light had turned golden, soft and low. Marcus worked quietly, each swing of the hammer echoing like a pulse. Eliza watched from the porch, sipping slowly, her eyes tracing the lines of his back, the way his shoulders held tension like memory. When he was done, he wiped his hands on a rag and turned to her. "That should hold." "For how long?" "Depends on who's leaning on it." That night, Eliza stood in the doorway long after he left. Theo stirred on the couch. She pulled a blanket over him, then stared out into the yard at the fence now standing straight and stubborn against the night. It wasn't the proposal she'd meant to make, not really. But something had begun. Eliza woke before the sun, her body responding more to habit than rest, the air in the house still and cool as she stepped barefoot into the kitchen. She poured herself a mug of coffee, black and bitter, and leaned against the sink, watching the sky shift from slate to silver beyond the window pane. Somewhere in the yard, the new fence cast quiet shadows, straight and unassuming. It was strange how something so simple could carry so much weight. She thought of Marcus, of his hands, steady and calloused, of the way he didn't flinch when she tossed that impossible question into the air. "Would you marry me?" The words still lingered in the corners of her mind like a dare, a thread pulled loose and left to unravel. Outside, the first birds began to chirp, and she set the mug down, tiptoeing past Theo, still tangled in his sheets, his arm flung over his head like a boy who dreamed in color. She let him sleep. He had school in an hour, but peace was rare and worth stealing time for. An envelope caught her eye on the floor just inside the front door. It hadn't been there last night. She picked it up slowly, her fingers going still as she turned it over. No stamp, no return address, just her name typed in block letters, Eliza Hartley. Her chest tightened. The seal peeled too easily, the flap given way with a whisper. Inside, a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature, just one line. "People remember who belongs here." Eliza stared at the words, a cold knot forming low in her stomach. She read it again and again. The air felt thinner somehow. She folded the paper slowly, placed it on the counter, then walked back to the hallway and locked the door. At breakfast, Theo noticed her silence. He poked at his toast, watching her with wide, perceptive eyes. "You okay, Mom?" She nodded, brushing a hand across his curls. "Just tired, baby." "You look like when the tree fell that time." She forced a smile. "It's nothing, promise. Eat your food." After dropping him off at school, she drove straight home, her hands tight on the steering wheel, the words of the letter echoing with every turn. She pulled into the driveway just as Marcus arrived, his truck crunching gravel behind her. He got out with a thermos in one hand and a tool belt slung over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing the moment he saw her face. "Something happen?" She didn't answer right away, just reached into her purse, pulled out the letter, and handed it to him. He read it once, then again, his jaw clenched. "Was it in the box?" She shook her head. "Inside, on the floor." "You locked the door last night?" "I always do." He handed the letter back, his expression unreadable. "This isn't a prank, Eliza. I know. And it's not just about you." She swallowed hard. "I think it's about you too." "Then it's about both of us." He paused. "You want me to stay for a while? Can you? I was going to offer anyway." She didn't say thank you, just nodded, the kind of nod that meant more than words could carry. They spent the day together in the backyard, repainting the porch swing, replacing loose slats. Liza made grilled cheese sandwiches with too much butter, and Marcus brewed coffee so strong it made her wince, but she drank it anyway. When Theo got home from school, he ran straight into Marcus's arms like it was the most natural thing in the world. That night, when the sun dipped low behind the trees and the house settled into quiet, Eliza found herself on the porch steps, the letter tucked between her fingers like a splinter. Marcus joined her without a word, sitting beside her, close but not touching. "You scared?" she asked finally. Not of them. Of what, then? Of you thinking you have to face this alone. She didn't answer, just looked out over the yard, her eyes landing on the fence. They wanted to shake us. Then we stay still. They want us gone. Then we stay louder. She smiled, faintly, the corner of her mouth curling like the beginning of a promise. You always talk in poetry? Only when it's late. And what happens in the morning? We fight better. The following morning, the rain came early and without warning, soft at first like a whisper against the windows, then steady, deliberate, soaking the ground and leaving the air thick with the smell of damp earth and honeysuckle. Eliza stood by the front window holding a cup of warm ginger tea, her eyes trailing the rivulets that chased each other down the glass. Marcus was still asleep on the couch, one arm slung over his eyes, the other draped loosely over his stomach, breathing even and slow. She hadn't meant for him to stay the night, but when the wind had picked up and the thunder had started to roll in the distance, neither of them had said it out loud, just quietly agreed that the safest place for him was here. Her gaze shifted toward the street, half expecting to see something out of place, a car parked too long, a figure watching from behind the hedges. But everything looked still, like the storm had scrubbed the neighborhood clean. She sipped her tea and thought about the letter again. People remember who belongs here. A sentence that sounded simple, but felt like a knife under the skin. It wasn't the first time she'd felt unwelcome, but something about this was more calculated, more personal. And she couldn't help but wonder what would come next. Marcus stirred just as the kettle clicked off again, lifting his head and blinking against the gray morning light. "You're up early," he muttered. "Didn't sleep much," she replied, walking into the kitchen and refilling her mug. "Something on your mind?" "Always." He sat up, rubbing the back of his neck, his t-shirt wrinkled and his voice still full of sleep. "Anything new outside?" "No, just rain." "That's something." She offered him a second mug, and they stood in the kitchen together, sipping in silence, the kind of silence that didn't need to be explained. After breakfast, Theo bounced into the room with the kind of energy only a 6-year-old could summon on a rainy Thursday. He wore a cape made from a towel and declared himself protector of lemon trees and destroyer of mean letters. Eliza laughed, the sound catching in her throat a little, and Marcus knelt to high-five him. "That's a solid job title," he said. "You hiring?" Theo nodded solemnly. "Only if you can build a treehouse that doesn't fall down." "Guess I better sharpen my skills." They played for a while, the three of them, turning the living room into a fortress of pillows and couch cushions while the storm howled against the windows. For a moment, it felt like a different life, one not held together by fear or memory, but by warmth and ridiculous laughter. Then the doorbell rang. Eliza froze mid-step, her hands gripping a blanket she was about to toss over a chair. Marcus stood immediately, motioning her back with a gentle wave. He opened the door slowly, his body angled just enough to shield whoever might be standing there. But it wasn't a threat. It was Florence, rain-damp and imperious, carrying a plastic bag and a fierce glint in her eye. "I brought cinnamon rolls and news," she said without waiting for an invitation. Inside, she peeled off her raincoat and tossed it over a chair, planting herself at the table as if she'd lived there her whole life. "What kind of news?" Eliza asked warily. Florence leaned in, her voice low. "I talked to Evelyn. You know Evelyn from the garden club. Don't look at me like that, she knows everyone. Anyway, Evelyn told me that Lillian Harris showed up at the town clerk's office yesterday, poking around for old land permits, something about reclassification, maybe trying to contest property zoning." Eliza's stomach dropped. Why? because she wants to make trouble before the hearing. She's fishing for a technicality, trying to make it look like Richard never had the right to leave you the house." Marcus swore under his breath. Eliza leaned back in her chair. "Is that even possible?" Florence shrugged. "Depends on the paperwork and how many people she's got in her pocket." Marcus looked at Eliza. "We need to find out what she has. If she's building a case, we're not going to let her drop it in our laps without a fight." Eliza nodded slowly. "I'll call Devlin. See if he can meet me at the records office tomorrow." Florence leaned back, satisfied. "Good. And eat your cinnamon roll. You'll need the energy." Later that day, while Marcus fixed the latch on the back gate and Theo took a nap, Eliza sat alone in the dining room, flipping through an old photo album she hadn't touched in years. The pages smelled like thyme, faintly musty, and the plastic film over each picture crackled when she turned it. There were photos of her and Richard at the beginning smiling awkwardly at some gala, her in a dress that didn't quite fit, him with a hand on her shoulder like a man posing with a trophy. It had never been love, not really, just comfort disguised as safety. And in between those photos, she saw it more clearly than she had before. The quiet distance, the way he never quite looked at her, only through her. She closed the book gently, resting her fingers on the cover. When Marcus came back in, damp from the rain and smelling faintly of cedar and soap, he paused in the doorway. "You okay?" "I'm remembering things that didn't happen the way I thought they did," she said quietly. "Sometimes the truth gets sharper when you look back." "Or clearer," he replied. "I used to think he gave me this house because he believed in me. Maybe he did, eventually. Doesn't make what came before any less real." She nodded, and they stood in the quiet together, the house breathing around them. That night, after Theo was asleep and the windows steamed with the last of the day's rain, Marcus joined her on the porch. They didn't say much, just sipped tea and watched the streetlights blink on one by one. Then he said, "What if we lost this house tomorrow? Would you regret staying?" She looked at him, startled. "No." "Would you regret asking me that question?" "Never." He nodded slowly. "Then whatever happens next, we face it standing up." She reached over, fingers curling gently around his. "I think I knew that the first day you walked up my driveway." "When you asked if I'd marry you?" "No, before that. When you didn't laugh at the broken fence, you just got to work." He smiled faintly. "Still building." She looked out at the yard, at the new lemon tree swaying slightly in the night breeze. "So am I." The courtroom smelled like old paper and stale coffee, the kind of scent that clung to memory like dust. Eliza sat in the hallway outside the hearing room, her palms pressed to her knees, trying to quiet the pulse hammering in her throat. Inside, the final phase of the estate hearing was set to begin. The hallway buzzed with hushed murmurs, the occasional click of polished shoes, the rustle of legal pads and case files being passed between hands like secrets. Marcus stood nearby, arms folded, jaw tense, his eyes fixed on the swinging door ahead as though he could will the outcome to bend. He hadn't said much since they arrived, but he hadn't left her side either. When the bailiff called her name, Eliza rose with the kind of poise she had only learned by necessity, the kind of calm that masks chaos. She stepped into the room with her shoulders back and her gaze forward, her heart steady only because it had been broken and repaired too many times to be fragile anymore. The opposing side was already seated Lillian Harris in a powder blue suit that looked like it cost more than Eliza's monthly income, her expression unreadable but cool. To Lillian's left sat a high-powered attorney named Crispin Ward, a man who spoke like a headline and moved like a knife. Eliza's lawyer, Devlin, nodded to her, his notes minimal but precise. The judge, a woman named Karen Morales, entered quietly. She was known for her impartiality and her impatience. "Let's keep this sharp," she said as she sat. "The court's time is not infinite." Ward stood first, delivering a rehearsed monologue about legacy, stability, and the alleged instability of a woman who had, in his words, once considered auctioning family heirlooms to pay for a child's dental surgery. Eliza didn't flinch. She didn't have to. She'd lived those decisions. She'd made them with her hands tied and her head held high. Devlin rose next and played the recording again. Richard's voice, rasping but firm, saying Eliza's name like it was a redemption. And then the Reverend took the stand again, speaking softly about promises kept and ghosts laid to rest. Eliza didn't cry, not even when Lillian's lawyer implied she had manipulated a dying man for real estate. She only said, "I took care of him when no one else would. I washed his hands. I reminded him of who he used to be. If that's manipulation, then I don't want to know what love is." The judge raised a brow at that, but said nothing. When it was done, the room emptied quickly, people eager to get back to their lives, to escape the weight of someone else's legacy. Marcus met her in the hallway, his eyes searching hers. "That wasn't easy," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it was necessary." "You're shaking." She looked down at her hands and laughed quietly. "Guess I didn't notice." He wrapped his hand over hers and steadied her. "You did more than show up today. You stood up." They didn't talk much on the way home. The car ride was quiet, filled only with the hum of tires on wet pavement and the occasional soft sigh from Theo, who had fallen asleep in the back seat. At home, she tucked her son into bed, kissed his forehead, and sat beside him for a long time, her hand resting on his chest as if to memorize the rhythm of his breathing. Downstairs, Marcus waited on the porch. The lemon tree stood in the moonlight, its leaves wet from the earlier rain, glistening like hope hadn't given up just yet. When she joined him, they didn't speak. They just listened to the crickets and the slow, steady heartbeat of a town that had tried to push her out. After a while, he said, "There's something about you, Eliza, the way you don't fold." "I fold," she said quietly, "just not where people can see it." He turned to her. "Would it scare you if I said I'm falling in love with you?" "Yes," she said, "but not for the reason you think." He waited. "I'm scared because I want to believe you. Then believe me. And what if it all goes away again? Then we build again," he said simply. "Even if the ground's uneven. Especially then." She reached for his hand and held it tightly. "You don't have to fix everything for me, Marcus." "I know," he said. "I just wanted to be here when you do it yourself." 2 days later, the verdict came by mail in official envelope, delivered with the quiet finality of a chapter closing. She opened it alone, standing in the kitchen, the morning light pouring through the window. Marcus wasn't there. He'd gone to get groceries. Theo was still asleep. The words were brief and coldly formal. The will had been upheld. She had won. The house was hers. She leaned against the counter, breath leaving her in a slow, unsteady rush. She didn't laugh. She didn't cry. She just let it settle into her bones like sunlight after too long in the cold. When Marcus returned, she met him at the door. He saw it in her face before she said a word. "It's over," she whispered. "You stayed. Told you I would." That night, they celebrated with grilled cheese sandwiches and 2 sweet lemonade. Florence came over, of course, bringing a bouquet of wildflowers and unsolicited legal advice. Theo made a banner that said, "You win Mommy," in crooked letters and taped it to the fridge. The next morning, Marcus asked her again, without ceremony, without fanfare. "If I asked for real this time, what would you say?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the lemon tree, now tall enough to cast a shadow. She touched one of its branches, its leaves still damp with morning dew. Then she turned back to him. "I'd say yes," she said softly, "but only if you promise to build the porch swing yourself." "Deal," he said, and he kissed her, not like a man claiming something, but like a man returning home.